The day Evelyn Barrett decided not to leave was the same day she had packed every last stitch of clothing she owned into a battered leather trunk and dragged it to the edge of the porch, fully intending to be gone before the afternoon sun dipped behind the red rock mesas of Redemption Creek, Texas. It was the autumn of 1882, and the land around the Weston Ranch was the kind of beautiful that broke a person a little if they let it. Cottonwood trees shivered gold along the creek bed. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at it directly. A hawk circled over the southern pasture, lazy and unhurried, as if the whole world below it was just scenery for its own private entertainment. Evelyn stood on that porch with her hands on her hips and her jaw set hard, watching the hawk and trying not to feel anything at all. She had been the housekeeper at the Weston Ranch for 8 months. She had come to Redemption Creek after answering a terse notice posted at the general store in San Angelo, 3 towns over. The notice had read, "Housekeeper needed, 3 children, good pay, no nonsense." It had been signed N. Weston, and she had assumed, incorrectly, that a man who communicated so efficiently would be equally efficient to work for, and that efficiency might, for once, make her life simple. Nathan Weston was not simple. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, and sun-darkened in the way that men became when they spent more of their lives outdoors than in. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone the mesas were made of, and eyes the deep gray-green of sage after a rare Texas rain. He wore his hat low and his words lower, and he had the particular brand of stubbornness that the frontier seemed to grow in men the way the land grew mesquite, wild, deeply rooted, and near impossible to remove once it had taken hold. He was also, in Evelyn's careful and reluctant assessment, one of the finest men she had ever encountered, which was precisely the problem. She had not come to Redemption Creek looking for a fine man. She had come because her late husband, Gerald Barrett, had left her with nothing but a good name and a pair of worn boots, and a woman in 1882 with no money and no family nearby did not have the luxury of pride when it came to securing employment. She had come to work. She had come to survive. She had not come to notice the way Nathan Weston's hands looked when he was mending a fence post in the early morning, or the way he read aloud to his youngest child before bed with a voice that dropped to something low and careful, like he was afraid of waking something gentle that lived inside those stories. She had noticed anyway. And noticing had made things complicated. The children were the reason she had stayed as long as she had, she told herself. 3 of them: Clara, who was 9 years old and fierce as a barn cat; Eli, who was 7 and spent most of his days trying to convince the horses to be his personal friends; and little June, who was 4 years old and had the kind of enormous brown eyes that made a person feel, when she looked at them directly, as though they had been handed something too precious to hold. Their mother, Catherine Weston, had died of fever nearly 2 years prior, and the grief in that house had settled into the walls and the floorboards, and the particular way the children went quiet sometimes, all at once, as if they had each heard the same sound that nobody else could hear. Evelyn had not planned to love them. She had planned to cook their meals, wash their clothes, see that they got to the schoolhouse in Redemption Creek on the days the schoolhouse was open, and keep a professional distance that would allow her to remain clear-headed about her situation. But Clara had come to her in the 3rd week and shown her a drawing she had made of her mother, and asked with a directness that was almost adult whether Evelyn thought the drawing looked right, and Evelyn had taken the paper in her hands and looked at it for a long time before saying that she thought it was a beautiful drawing, and that whoever this woman was, she must have been very loved to have been drawn so carefully. And Clara had looked at her with those knowing 9-year-old eyes and said, "She was." And then Clara had gone back outside, and Evelyn had stood in the kitchen for a while with a feeling in her chest that she could not entirely name. She had been lost from that point forward. The trouble with Nathan had started, as most troubles did, with a misunderstanding. In the 6th month of her employment, a woman named Dorothy Hale had come calling from town. Dorothy Hale was a widow herself, respectable and well-dressed, and she had made no secret of the fact that she found Nathan Weston an appealing prospect for remarriage. She had brought a pie. She had sat in the front room and laughed at things that were not particularly funny, and Nathan had been polite in the way he was polite to everyone, which was to say careful and measured, and he had not given Dorothy Hale any particular encouragement. But Dorothy Hale had returned 2 weeks later, and then again, and the whole town of Redemption Creek had begun to quietly rearrange their expectations around the idea that Nathan Weston was courting, or was about to be. Evelyn had told herself it was none of her business. She had made herself very busy in the kitchen during Dorothy Hale's visits, and she had been perfectly pleasant to the woman whenever they crossed paths, and she had not allowed herself to examine too closely why the sound of Dorothy's laughter in the front room made her want to scrub the cast-iron skillet with unnecessary violence. The real trouble had come on a Saturday in early September when Nathan had said something careless. He had not meant it to be cruel. She understood that now, standing on the porch with her trunk beside her. He had been tired, bone-tired in the way that ranchers got when the work piled up and the body started protesting, and she had asked him about the fall muster, and whether he wanted her to prepare extra provisions for the ranch hands, and he had said, without really thinking about it, "You don't need to trouble yourself with all that, Evelyn. Once I've sorted things out with Dorothy, the household arrangements will likely change anyway." He had said it the way a man says something he considers to be practical information, something courteous and fair, giving her advance notice of a change in her employment. He had not said it to hurt her, but the words had gone in like a splinter, small and sharp, and she had spent the 2 weeks since working them deeper with every thought she could not stop thinking. She was the housekeeper. She was the hired help. She kept his children fed and laundered and listened to, and she would be replaced with a wife when a wife was arranged, and that was the proper and reasonable order of things. The fact that Clara had started sleeping with her door open, because she said she slept better knowing Evelyn was down the hall. The fact that Eli had brought her a flat, smooth river stone last week and presented it with the solemnity of a man presenting a jewel, because he said it was the exact color of her eyes. The fact that June had taken to climbing into her lap every evening after supper and staying there until she fell asleep, one small fist curled into the fabric of Evelyn's dress, as if holding on through the night. None of that changed what she was, and if she stayed and watched Nathan Weston marry Dorothy Hale, she would lose all of them anyway. Dorothy Hale did not look like a woman who would want another woman's warm presence woven through her new household. It was better to leave now, before the leaving became impossible. That was what she had told herself at 5 o'clock in the morning when she started packing. That was what she had told herself through breakfast, when June had looked up from her porridge and asked if Evelyn would braid her hair the fancy way today, and Evelyn had braided it the fancy way with hands that barely shook at all. That was what she had told herself through the whole morning, right up until the moment she dragged the trunk to the porch and stood there looking at that hawk, and Clara came out through the front door and stopped dead at the sight of the trunk. Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the trunk, and then she looked at Evelyn, and her 9-year-old face was absolutely unreadable in the way that children's faces became when they were working very hard not to show what they were feeling. "Are you going somewhere?" Clara asked. Evelyn opened her mouth and closed it again. "I was thinking about it," she said finally, because she could not lie to Clara. She had discovered that in the very first month. Clara always knew. "Because of Miss Hale?" Clara asked. "That is not something you should worry about," Evelyn said. "Eli cried last night," Clara said. "He thinks you're leaving. He would not tell me how he knew, but Eli always knows things. He said you had sad eyes at supper." The splinter went a little deeper. "Where is your father?" Evelyn asked. "Barn," Clara said. She paused. "Are you going to tell him goodbye?" It was the way she said it, quiet and direct, without accusation but without pretending either, that made Evelyn square her shoulders and say, "Yes, I think I should." She found Nathan in the barn just as Clara had said. He was brushing down his bay gelding, moving in the long, methodical strokes that meant he had something on his mind. He heard her come in and looked over his shoulder, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop brushing. "Evelyn," he said, "what's happened?" "Nothing has happened," she said. "I am leaving. I have my trunk on the porch. I wanted to say goodbye and to give you enough notice that you can make arrangements for the children before I go. I can stay through the week if that helps." He stared at her. He set the brush down very slowly, the way a man sets something down when he is giving himself time to think. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes." "On account of what I said about Dorothy." "On account of many things," Evelyn said, which was both true and carefully insufficient. He took his hat off, turned it in his hands once, and set it on a post. She had noticed he did that when he was getting serious about something, removing the hat like a man removing a shield. "I did not mean it the way it sounded," he said. "I know that." "I have not offered Dorothy Hale anything," he said. "I have not made any arrangement. She has come calling, and I have been civil, because being uncivil to a neighbor is not something I'm willing to do. But there is no arrangement." "Nathan," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like something she should not be permitted to say, too familiar, too practiced by months of using it in her thoughts. "It is not necessary for you to explain yourself to me. I am your employee. You may make whatever arrangements you see fit." "Stop saying it like that," he said, and his voice had an edge to it that she had not heard before, something rougher than his usual careful measure. "Like what?" "Like it doesn't matter to you," he said. "Like you're reading off a page." She looked at him for a moment that stretched out long and unsteady, and then she looked away because looking at him directly had started to become genuinely dangerous to her composure. "The children will miss you," he said. His voice had dropped back down to careful. "June will be devastated. She has already lost one woman she loved." That was not a fair thing to say, and they both knew it, and he looked like he knew it the moment it was out of his mouth. "That is not a reason for me to stay," Evelyn said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "You cannot hold me here with the children's grief, Nathan. That is not right." "You're correct," he said. "That was wrong of me. I apologize." The apology was immediate and genuine, and it made everything harder, as his decency always did. "I am staying for the children," she said, and the words came out before she had fully decided to say them. "Not for you. I want to be clear about that. I cannot watch you build a life with someone else from the inside of this house, and I will not pretend that is a simple thing for me to do. But the children did not ask for any of this, and June is 4 years old, and Eli already cried last night, and Clara is 9 years old, and she has already been through more loss than a child should have to manage, and so I am saying that I will stay. For them, not for you. And I think you should understand that difference." The barn was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a horse was moving through the paddock. The light came through the gaps in the barn boards in long, dusty strips. Nathan Weston looked at her for what felt like a considerable amount of time, and his gray-green eyes held something in them that she could not read and was not sure she had the courage to read even if she could. "Stay for whatever reason you like," he said quietly. That was all. No argument, no pushing, no attempt to untangle the declaration she had made or the one she had carefully not made. Just those 6 words, offered simply, without condition. She looked at him. He picked his hat back up from the post, settled it on his head, and turned back to his horse. She walked back to the house. She dragged her trunk back inside. She put her things away, and she made supper, and when June climbed into her lap that evening, she held the child a little tighter than usual, and June did not seem to mind. The weeks that followed were different, and Evelyn could not have explained precisely why, except that something had shifted in the quality of the air between her and Nathan Weston, like a door that had been opened just slightly and left that way, not thrown wide, but no longer closed. He did not bring Dorothy Hale into the house again. The woman continued to be a presence in town, of course, and there were whispers at the general store and the post office about what Nathan Weston intended, because Redemption Creek was the kind of small Texas town where people's intentions were considered community property. Old Mabel Sutherland, who ran the post office with the authority of a minor deity, informed Evelyn one Wednesday morning that she ought to know Dorothy Hale had been seen riding out toward the Weston property. And the implication was that Evelyn ought to have feelings about this, that she should confess immediately for Mabel's satisfaction. Evelyn said she would take the household mail and her opinion on the matter. "Thank you," which made Mabel narrow her eyes and nod with the particular approval that prickly dignity always received in a frontier town. What was actually happening, though Evelyn was careful not to draw conclusions, was that Nathan had begun to be present in different ways. He had always been present in the functional sense, the owner of the house and the employer, the man who came in at the end of the day and ate the supper she made and exchanged the necessary information about the ranch. But now he was present in the other way, the way that took up more space. He had taken to drinking his morning coffee on the porch in the time between his first round of morning chores and his second, which happened to be the same time Evelyn brought her own coffee out to check on what the weather was doing and think through the day's work. He did not make a production of it. He simply began to be there, leaning against the porch rail, and she began to bring 2 cups out of habit, and they would stand in the blue October morning and drink their coffee and talk about the day or not talk at all, and both of those things became equally comfortable over time. He had also started asking her opinion on things that were not strictly her domain. What she thought about the eastern fence line, which needed repair but which he was considering moving entirely to better manage the cattle. What she thought about Eli's cough, which had persisted for 2 weeks, and which she had already decided probably needed Doc Henshaw's attention. What she thought about the school situation in Redemption Creek, where the schoolmarm had recently married, and there was now uncertainty about whether the school would continue through winter. She gave him her opinions, because she had them and they were good ones, and he listened to them with the full and genuine attention of a man who had decided that her thinking was worth hearing. He did not always do what she suggested, but he engaged with it seriously, and that was more than she had expected from most men. The children watched all of this with the attentiveness of small, sharp-eyed observers who had been hoping for something without entirely admitting it. Clara began inventing reasons for Evelyn and her father to occupy the same room. Eli started reporting to Evelyn with great seriousness various impressive things his father had done that day, apparently convinced that his father's merits required a public relations campaign. June, who was 4 and therefore operating on pure instinct, simply began referring to Evelyn as her mother to anyone who came within range, which caused Evelyn considerable embarrassment and Nathan visible discomfort, and Clara to tell her sister in a tone of great authority that they should not do that, while looking at both adults with an expression that said she personally saw no reason why it should not become true. One evening in late October, Evelyn was in the kitchen by herself, working through the week's accounts by lamplight. The ranch hands had been paid. The supplies were tallied. The winter provisions needed to be ordered from the merchant in San Angelo, and she was working through what they would need and whether the budget stretched to the good quality flour or only the rough ground variety when Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Working late," he said. "Winter provisions," she said, without looking up. "We need to order before the roads get difficult. I have a list if you want to look it over." He came in, poured himself a cup of the coffee that was still on the stove, and sat down across from her at the kitchen table. She slid the list across to him. He looked it over in the careful way he looked at anything involving numbers, and she watched his eyes move down the page and waited. "You've put the good flour," he said. "The children do better with it. Eli's stomach is sensitive. I put it in as a question mark if you think we can't manage it." "We can manage it," he said. He slid the list back. "This is good work." "It is what you pay me for," she said, and the words came out more sharply than she intended, more defensive, and they both heard it. He looked up at her. "I did not mean it as a small thing," he said. "I meant it as a true thing." You have run this house better than it has been run in a long time, and I am aware that is worth more than what I pay you, and I want you to know I'm aware of it." She looked at him across the lamplit table, and the yellow light made the planes of his face softer than the daylight did, and she felt the dangerous warmth moving through her chest again, the one she had been managing for months with varying success. "Thank you," she said, because she did not have anything safer to offer. "Evelyn," he said, and he said it the way she sometimes said his name in her thoughts, like it was something he had decided he had the right to say carefully. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can answer honestly and it won't change anything about your situation here." She waited. "Are you happy here?" he asked. "Not as the housekeeper, I mean in general in this place, with the children, with this life. Are you happy?" The question was so direct and so unexpected that for a moment she did not know what to do with it. People in 1882 did not typically ask a woman in service whether she was happy. They asked whether she was capable, whether she was trustworthy, whether she was reliable. Whether she was happy was a luxury question, the kind a person asked when they were considering whether your happiness was something that mattered to them specifically. "I am happy with the children," she said honestly. "And the rest of it? The rest of it is complicated," she said. He nodded as if this was the answer he had expected. He finished his coffee. He stood up and he looked at her for a moment from the doorway, and then he said, "I am going to call on Dorothy Hale tomorrow. Not to pursue anything further, but to be honest with her, because I have not been honest with her and I should be." Evelyn kept her eyes on the list of provisions. "That is your business to manage however you see fit," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I just thought you should know." He went to bed and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time after, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the horses settling, the wind off the high plains, the distant conversation of coyotes, and tried to be careful about what she was allowing herself to feel. He went to town the next morning and returned by midday, and he did not tell her what had transpired with Dorothy Hale, and she did not ask. But the particular quality of tension that had been living in the house since September seemed to have loosened slightly, the way a wound loosens once the worst is drawn out of it. That same week, two things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that a man came to the ranch looking for work. His name was Pete Galloway, and he had the look of a drifter who had been drifting so long the movement had become the destination. He was hired on for the winter muster and given a bunk in the ranch hand quarters, and Evelyn thought nothing of it except that there would be one more man to cook for. The second thing was that Eli's cough got worse. Doc Henshaw came out from Redemption Creek in his buggy, and he was a serious-faced man of 60 who had been practicing medicine on the frontier long enough to have opinions about most things, including the way Nathan Weston was looking at his housekeeper when he thought nobody was watching, about which he said nothing except in the privacy of his own head. He examined Eli thoroughly and said that the boy's lungs were clear, which was the important thing, but that he needed rest and warmth and no exposure to the cold air of the plains for at least 3 weeks, which meant no school and no running about the yard in the morning chill. Eli, who had never found a rule he could not negotiate with, immediately began petitioning for exceptions. Evelyn listened to his arguments with great seriousness and denied all of them. She moved a rocking chair near the kitchen hearth so that Eli could be warm and occupied while she worked, and she found him books from the small collection on the ranch's shelf and read to him on the afternoons when she had time, and she taught him to play checkers on a board that had been gathering dust in the parlor. It was during one of these checker games that Eli looked up at her with the solemnity that 7-year-olds deployed when they were about to say something they had been thinking about for a long time. "My papa looks at you when you are not looking," Eli said. Evelyn moved her checker piece. "Your turn," she said. "He looked at my mama the same way," Eli said. "I remember. I was 5, so I remember some things." Evelyn felt the warmth that went to strange places in her chest. "Your mama must have been a very wonderful woman," she said. "She was," Eli said. "Clara says she was the best. I think she was the best too, But I also think that you are very good, Evelyn. I think you could be good too. At the same time, he said this with the pragmatic confidence of a child who had worked something out carefully and found it logical. I do not think being good at one thing stops somebody from being good at a different thing. That is a very wise thought, Evelyn said, and she was grateful her voice came out steadily. Papa's turn to move, Eli said. She looked up. She had not heard Nathan come in, but he was standing in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame. And from the stillness in his face, she could see that he had been there long enough to hear at least some of what Eli had said. He caught her eye and something moved in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one, private and warm. "It's a checker game, son," he said to Eli. "I'm not invited." "You can watch," Eli said grandly. Nathan came in and sat down, and he did not play, but he watched, and the three of them stayed by the kitchen fire as the afternoon went gray outside, and Evelyn thought, very quietly, and with a care she was beginning to lose the ability to sustain, "I could live in this." The following week, the situation with Pete Galloway became a problem. Evelyn had been going to the well every morning before the ranch hands were up, because she liked the quiet of those first minutes of the day, and because the morning water always tasted different and cleaner than any other. On this particular morning, she arrived at the well to find Pete Galloway already there, which she had not expected. He was not filling a water bucket. He was simply standing there, and when she approached, he turned and looked at her with the deliberate attention of a man who had been waiting. She was polite but brief. She filled her bucket and turned to go, and he said something that stopped her, something that walked the line between comment and implication in the way that certain men had perfected, something that made very clear he had been watching her movements and had drawn conclusions about her situation that he thought gave him an opening. She did not respond. She walked back to the house. She debated with herself all morning about whether to say anything to Nathan. It was a frontier ranch. She was not naive enough to be surprised that men like Pete Galloway existed, and a single incident with no physical threat was not necessarily something that required an employer's intervention. She had managed difficult men before. She was capable of managing this one. But at mid-morning, when she went out to the clothesline with the week's laundry, Galloway appeared again, and this time his words were less ambiguous, and his proximity was closer than she was willing to accept, and she set down the laundry basket and looked at him with a directness that made most men reconsider. Pete Galloway was not most men in this particular department. She went inside, and she found Nathan in the front room going over the ranch ledger, and she told him what had happened in a plain and factual way, without drama or embellishment, because she was not a woman who saw the use of either. She told him exactly what Galloway had said and where he had positioned himself and what she had done in response. Nathan listened without interrupting. His face went through several things while she spoke, things she watched carefully, and what she saw was not performative outrage or the paternalistic thunder that she had encountered from other men in other situations. It was quieter than that and more dangerous, the kind of anger that was controlled because the person controlling it had decided that control served a purpose. He set the ledger down. He said, "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said. "I am telling you because I thought you should know." "You were right to tell me," he said. He went out. She did not follow him, but she heard later from two of the other ranch hands that Nathan had spoken to Pete Galloway in the yard, and that the conversation had been brief and final, and that Galloway had packed his gear and left the property before noon. What was said in the yard she did not know for certain, but the manner of Nathan's return to the house told her enough. He came back measured and settled, the particular settled of a man who has done the thing that needed doing and has no regret about it. That evening, after the children were in bed, he found her in the parlor with her mending. "He's gone," he said, which she had already understood. "Thank you," she said. "I should have been more careful about who I brought onto the property," he said. "That is on me." "You could not have known," she said. "I want you to know," he said, and he came and sat in the chair across from her, the lamp between them throwing golden light up against his face, "that this is your home as much as it is mine. You have the same right to be safe here as any of us." The word home went through her like a current. "It is your ranch," she said carefully. "It is your home," he said again, and his voice had the quality of a man who is saying exactly what he means and intending that it be heard as such. She looked at her mending. She looked at her hands. She did not look at him because if she looked at him she was going to have to make a decision about something she had not entirely prepared herself to make yet. "Nathan," she said. "Evelyn," he said, and the way he said it back to her, the same measured and private weight, made her look up. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes that she had spent 8 months pretending not to notice, and there was something in them that she had stopped trying to misread, even though misreading it had been so much safer. "I told you I was staying for the children," she said. "That was true when I said it." "I know," he said. "I'm not entirely certain it is still the whole truth," she said. The lamp flickered. Outside, the plain's wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like rushing water. "No," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "No," she said. And then, because she had been honest with herself for long enough that the dishonesty had become exhausting, "I find that I am staying because I want to be here, because this place has become something to me that I did not plan on. Because the children are not the only reason anymore, even if they were the reason I unpacked my trunk." The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something being laid down carefully in a shared space, and both people looking at it and neither of them backing away. "I am glad you unpacked your trunk," Nathan said. "Are you?" she said, not quite a question. "I have been since the morning you did it," he said. "I have been working out how to say that without making you feel cornered because I know what it is to feel like you have no options, and I do not want to be someone who takes away options." She thought about that. She thought about her 8 months on this ranch, and about Gerald Barrett, who had been kind enough but who had never in their 4 years of marriage sat across from her with a lamp between them and said anything even remotely like that. She thought about the hawk that had been circling the day she almost left, unhurried and free, doing exactly as it liked. "You do not make me feel cornered," she said. He nodded. He did not rush anything. He sat with what she had said, the way he sat with everything until it settled. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, if that is something you would be willing to permit." She thought about propriety and practicality, about the fact that they lived in the same house and there was nothing in the world less simple than what he was proposing. "We live in the same house," she said. "I know," he said. "I expect it will be the most unusual courtship in the history of Redemption Creek." A pause. "Though with this town that is a competitive category." She laughed. She had not been expecting to laugh, and the surprise of it seemed to please him, because something shifted in his expression that was warm and open in a way she had rarely seen from him, like sun coming through the barn boards. "All right," she said. "Call on me then." He called on her. He did it in the small ways available to a man and woman living under the same roof with 3 observant children, and the opinions of a small Texas town pressing gently through every wall. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bed, the last of the autumn ones, yellow and dry at the edges, presented with a directness that was entirely Nathan, and not at all what she might have expected from a man beginning to court. He asked her to ride with him in the evenings when the light was going gold, and the plains stretched out in every direction like something made for looking at. He sat beside her at church in Redemption Creek, and did not comment on the fact that old Mabel Sutherland nearly twisted her neck in the pew ahead of them trying to observe this development. Clara, witnessing all of this, became serene in a way that 9-year-olds were not typically serene, a deep satisfaction radiating from her that she attempted to disguise as casual indifference and entirely failed to manage. Eli reported developments to June in a running commentary that the 4-year-old received with great attention, and then summarized incorrectly to anyone who came to the ranch, so that by November even the feed merchant in Redemption Creek had heard from June Weston, in her bright and confident 4-year-old voice, that her papa was bringing Evelyn flowers every day, which was an exaggeration, and that they were going to get married very soon, which was a projection, but which June stated with the confidence of a child who has decided the future and sees no reason to leave it to chance. Thanksgiving came with a cold front that pushed down from the north and frosted the grass white by morning. Evelyn cooked a supper that was, by any reasonable assessment, extraordinary, and the ranch hands came in from the cold, and the long table in the big room was crowded with people and noise, and the particular warmth that comes from enough bodies in a room with a fire going well. Nathan sat at the head of the table, and she sat at the other end, because the table needed managing at both ends, and at some point during the meal she looked up and found him looking at her from across all those people and all that noise with an expression that made her feel, suddenly, as though there was nobody else in the room at all. After supper, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children had been put to bed and the dishes were washed and the fire was banked, Nathan came to the kitchen where she was finishing the last of the tidying, and he said without preamble, "I want to marry you, Evelyn." She set down the dish she was drying. "You have not been calling on me for even 2 months, she said. "No," he said, "but I have known you for 8 months, and I think that has to count for something." "The town will talk," she said. "The town is already talking," he said. "Mabel Sutherland has been talking since October. I do not think we can make it meaningfully worse." "The children," she started. "The children have been campaigning for this since September," he said, and the dry warmth in his voice when he said it made her smile against her will. "June told the feed merchant last week that we were getting married soon. I did not correct her. I thought I should ask you first." She looked at him across the kitchen. The fire was low and the lamp was doing its warm and golden work, and outside the plains were silent and frozen, and the stars over Texas were enormous and close and brilliant. "I came here with nothing," she said. "I need you to understand that. I am a woman who answered a notice on a board in San Angelo because I had no other choices. I am not," she stopped. "I do not want you to marry me because you feel responsible for me, or because it is convenient, or because the children need a mother." "Evelyn," he said. "I need to say it," she said. "Say it then," he said with patience. "I want to know that if I had arrived at this ranch with money in my pocket and a family nearby and every option in the world available to me, you would still be standing in this kitchen asking me this question," she said. He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and she looked up. "If you had ridden into Redemption Creek on a white horse with a fortune in your saddlebag," he said, "I believe I would have found a way to meet you, and I believe I would still be standing exactly here asking you exactly this, because it is not your circumstances I am asking to marry. It is you, Evelyn Barrett, who argues with me about fence lines and makes the children feel safe and drinks coffee on my porch in the morning and looks at this land like she sees the same thing I see when I look at it." She was quiet for a long moment. She was aware of the weight of everything she had carried since Gerald died, since before that even the careful management of having nothing to fall back on, the constant arithmetic of survival. And she was aware, standing in this kitchen, that the arithmetic had changed, that she was being offered something different than survival, something that was actually about living. "Yes," she said. The word was simple, the way the truest things were simple. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, the rough and weathered hand of a man who spent his life working the land, and it was the most careful touch she had ever been offered by anyone, and she leaned into it because she was done arguing with herself about what she wanted. He kissed her, and it was not an impulsive kiss or a dramatic one. It was thorough and honest, and it tasted like the coffee they had drunk on the porch that morning, and like every morning on that porch they were going to drink after this one. They were married in December, in the church in Redemption Creek, on a day so cold the breath of every person in attendance made small clouds in the air of the sanctuary. The children were in the front pew. Clara in a dress Evelyn had made her, and Eli in the collar that pinched, and June in the pink ribbon she had requested with such intensity that its absence would have constituted a diplomatic incident. Clara did not cry, because Clara had decided early in life that crying was something she would do only in private, but her face had the brightness of a child who has received exactly what she had hoped for. Eli sat very straight and very proud, as if he was personally responsible for the outcome, which he perhaps partially was. June, when the Reverend pronounced them married, announced loudly and with great satisfaction, "Now she is our mama," and this observation received both laughter and more than a few damp eyes from the assembled congregation of Redemption Creek. Mabel Sutherland told everyone afterward that she had seen it coming from the very first day, which was not true, but which everyone allowed her, because she was the postmistress and her goodwill was a practical necessity. The first winter of their marriage was cold and close and wonderful in the way that first things often were. The ranch was small and the work was constant, and there was nothing easy about frontier life in the Texas plains in December 1882. But there was a quality to the house that had changed, something that Evelyn could feel in the mornings when she came downstairs, and the stove was already going because Nathan had risen before her to start it. And in the evenings when they sat by the fire after the children were in bed, her with her mending and him with the ranch books, not always talking, but present in the same space in the way that meant something. She learned things about him that she had not known in 8 months of professional proximity. She learned that he had a habit of waking at 3 in the morning and going to stand at the window of whatever room he was in, not from insomnia precisely, but from some watchfulness he had developed on the frontier that never entirely let him sleep through till dawn. She learned that he had been born in Virginia, that his father had been a man of difficult temper who had taken his family west when Nathan was 12, and that the frontier had suited Nathan in ways that Virginia never had, because on the frontier a man's quality was measured in what he could do, and not in what family he came from. She learned that he had loved Nathan Weston with the steady and devoted love of a young man who had found something right and known it, and that her death had left in him a silence that he had been living in for nearly 2 years, a silence that had become so habitual he had stopped noticing it until it began to fill again. "I did not know it was silent until you made it less so," he told her one night quietly, not as a poetic thing but as an observation, the way he made most observations, factually and without flourish. She told him things too. She told him about Gerald, who had been a decent man and a poor manager, and who had left her in a situation that was not the result of malice, but of a particular blindness that some men had about the practical realities their wives were left to manage. She told him about her father, who had been a teacher in Ohio, and had given her more education than women typically received, which she had always considered both a gift and a complication, because it made her opinions larger than the spaces she was usually given to put them in. She told him that she had been lonely for a long time before she came to Redemption Creek, not a dramatic or desperate loneliness, but the quiet kind, the kind you carried so long it stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like a permanent feature of yourself. He listened to all of it with the full and steady attention she had come to recognize as characteristically his, and at the end he said, "You do not have to carry that anymore," which was not a complex thing to say, but which was said with enough conviction that she found herself inclined to believe it. Spring came to the ranch the way it always did on the Texas plains, not gently but decisively, the cold breaking almost overnight, and the land switching over to the vivid green that only lasted a few weeks before the summer heat burnt it brown again. Evelyn had started to love those weeks of green, the way the whole landscape looked surprised by itself, and she made a point of going out to the creek with the children on a Saturday afternoon in April, when the cottonwoods were just beginning to leaf out, and the water was running high with snowmelt from somewhere to the north. Clara waded in up to her knees with her skirts hiked, and her face lit up with the kind of joy she did not allow herself in public company. Eli threw rocks into the current with scientific precision, studying the trajectory of each splash. June sat in Evelyn's lap on the bank and ate the biscuits Evelyn had brought in a cloth and offered commentary on everything she saw, because June was not a child who experienced the world quietly. Nathan sat beside Evelyn on the bank. He had his hat pushed back on his head, and his arms resting on his knees and his eyes moving over the 3 children in the creek, with the expression he had when he was counting something he was grateful for. Happy. He asked her the same question he had asked in the kitchen before everything changed, but with a different current under it now. Yes, she said, and it was true in a different way than she had known it could be true, large and uncomplicated and settled. He took her hand, which was something he had started doing in private moments, not making a thing of it, just taking it the way a man takes something he has decided belongs to him, and to which he belongs equally. Good, he said. The months that followed brought the particular texture of a life being built with intention. The ranch grew, not dramatically but steadily, as Nathan's careful management began to show returns. He expanded the herd. He hired 2 new hands, men he knew personally and vouched for, and the property felt less solitary with more people moving through it purposefully. Evelyn took over the management of the household accounts entirely, at Nathan's request, because she was better at the numbers than he was and they both knew it, and she began to take a quiet satisfaction in the way the ledgers balanced more neatly under her attention. She also became, in ways that were not formal but were entirely real, a person of some standing in Redemption Creek. She organized a subscription to bring a new schoolmarm to town when the position remained vacant through summer, going house to house with a ledger and a steady purpose that brooked no comfortable excuses from people who could afford to contribute. The schoolmarm arrived in September, young and sharp and from Missouri, and the school reopened, and Clara went back with the expression of a person returning to a beloved place, and Evelyn felt something she recognized belatedly as civic pride, which was not an emotion she had expected to encounter in Redemption Creek, Texas. In the late summer of 1883, she understood that she was carrying a child. She sat with this knowledge for a few days before she said anything to Nathan, not from fear but from wanting to understand the shape of it herself first. She thought about her body, and about the seasons of this land she had come to, and about the 3 children who were already hers in every way that mattered. She thought about what Nathan had lost and what she had lost and what they had together made from those losses, and she felt something that was not exactly happiness and not exactly wonder but was adjacent to both of them, warm and private and specific. She told him on a Tuesday evening. She told him plainly, the way she told him most things, without build-up or performance. She simply said, when they were alone in the kitchen after the children were in bed, "I am going to have a child." He looked at her for a moment. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was processing something important, very still, very focused, and then something came through it that she had not seen before, something raw and unguarded and enormous. He came across the kitchen and took both her hands and held them, and he did not say anything for a moment, and then he said in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He pressed her hands between both of his for a moment, and she could feel the controlled emotion in the pressure of it, the way a man who did not often let himself feel things in visible ways tried to communicate something that was too large for the usual channels. "Thank you," he said. It was an odd thing to say, and they both knew it was odd, but it was also exactly right, because it was not a transactional thank you but the kind that came from a deep and personal place, the gratitude of a man who had been given something he had not expected to want again, and now understood how much he had missed wanting it. They told the children together the next morning. June received this information with the satisfaction of a person whose predictions are being validated. Eli asked several practical questions about the timeline and logistics, which were answered honestly, and to his evident satisfaction. Clara did not say much at first, but later that day, she came and found Evelyn in the kitchen and stood beside her at the work table, and after a while she said, without quite looking at her, "I am glad it is you." Evelyn set down what she was doing and looked at the girl, her girl, this fierce and careful 9-year-old who had first come to her with a drawing of her mother, and asked whether it looked right. "So am I," Evelyn said. Clara nodded and helped her finish preparing supper, and they worked side by side without further ceremony, which was exactly right. The pregnancy was not easy in all respects. The Texas heat of that summer was punishing, and the work of a ranch household did not accommodate much physical accommodation, and Doc Henshaw came out twice to check on her progress with the manner of a man who was accustomed to delivering both good and sobering news on the frontier, and preferred to stay ahead of the latter. He pronounced her healthy both times, with the caveat that she ought to rest more than she was resting, which was advice she acknowledged and partially followed. Nathan was attentive in ways that she found both touching and occasionally excessive. He reassigned certain physical tasks to others without making a discussion of it, which she appreciated. He occasionally looked at her with a worry that he was working not to impose on her, which she noticed and which moved her, the care he took not to make his concern her burden. "I am not fragile," she told him once, when she caught him moving a water bucket she had been about to carry herself. "I know you're not," he said. "I am carrying the bucket because I would like to, not because I think you cannot." She allowed this. She had decided, in the months of their marriage, that certain of his caring acts were best received as the expression of feeling they were rather than managed as potential encroachments on her capability. Nathan Weston was not a man who used concern as a mechanism of control. His concern was simply concern, and the difference was important to her. October arrived, and with it a north wind that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods and reminded the Texas plains that winter was a reasonable distance away. Evelyn thought about the October before, when she had packed her trunk and unpacked it again, when she had stood on the porch and watched a hawk, when she had gone into a barn and said something honest that had cost her a great deal of fear to say. She thought about how entirely different the world had become in 1 year. The baby came on a night in November, 1883, with Doc Henshaw attending and Nathan present in the way she had asked him to be, which was to say nearby and within reach. The labor was long, but the outcome was good, and when it was done she was holding a son. A boy, solid and indignant, and with a quantity of dark hair that was entirely his own opinion. Nathan held him with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before, and with an expression that was raw in the way he rarely allowed himself to be raw, something that was very close to reverence. "What will we call him?" Evelyn asked, tired down to her bones and happier than she had known it was possible to be while that tired. "I thought we might call him James," he said, "for your father." She had told him about her father, the Ohio schoolteacher who had given her books and the belief that her mind was worth using. She had not suggested the name. He had simply remembered and held it for the right moment. "James," she said. "James Weston," he said. She looked at her husband holding her son in the lamplight of the room where she had spent a year making herself a life, and she felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. The trunk packed and unpacked, the notice on a board in San Angelo, the hawk circling free over the red rock mesas, Clara's drawing, Eli's river stone, June's arms around her neck, the morning coffee on the porch, the 6 words that had given her the room to choose. "Stay for whatever reason you like." She had stayed. And the reasons had multiplied beyond counting, grown into something she would not have had the imagination to plan for, back when she was a woman with worn boots and a good name and very little else. She had stayed and built and been chosen in return, and the choosing had gone in every direction until it was not possible to untangle who had chosen whom first or whether it mattered, because the outcome was the same. This kitchen, this man, these children, this son, this life. In the spring of 1884, When James was 4 months old and beginning to develop opinions about the world with a vigor that suggested he had inherited something from both his parents, Clara turned 10 years old. The birthday was marked with a cake that Evelyn made from a recipe she had carried in her memory since Ohio, a real layer cake with sugar icing, which was a considerable undertaking in a ranch kitchen, but which Clara received with the kind of contained delight that she allowed herself only in front of the people she trusted most. Clara unwrapped the present from her father, which was a new sketchbook and a full set of drawing pencils, and held them against her chest for a moment before she said to Evelyn, "I want to draw you, properly, when I am good enough." "You are already good enough," Evelyn said. "I want to be better," Clara said with the determination that was her most fundamental quality. "I want to do it right." It was not lost on Evelyn that this was the same language Clara had used a year and a half earlier about the drawing of her mother, the same care, the same standard. "I will wait," Evelyn said. Summer came and went in the particular way of Texas summers, relentless and beautiful in equal measure, and the ranch continued to prosper in its steady way. And James Weston learned to sit up and then to pull himself along the kitchen floor with a determination that made Eli declare him a very impressive baby, which James seemed to find appropriate. The older children had each, in their way, made their peace with all the change of the past 2 years. Clara was 10 now, beginning to be interested in the world beyond the ranch, asking questions about places she had read about in the books that came through Redemption Creek, talking about what a girl might do when she was grown if the world cooperated. Evelyn gave her honest answers and did not say that the world would cooperate easily, because it would not, but she also did not say that it was immovable, because she had moved parts of it herself, one determined action at a time. Eli at 8 had become, against all odds, the best friend of a horse named Cooper, which had been Nathan's original aim when he got the old quarter horse, but which had been intended as a therapeutic and educational process, and had become, in Eli's management, something more like a partnership of equals. Eli talked to Cooper. Cooper listened with the particular patience of an old horse who had seen things. Evelyn once watched Eli tell Cooper about a problem he was having with arithmetic, in great and specific detail, and Cooper rotated one ear in a way that suggested he found the situation concerning. June was 5 and attending school now, in the new schoolhouse with the Missouri schoolmarm, and the schoolmarm had written home in October to say that June Weston was the most confident and verbally capable child in the primary group, which was a diplomatic way of saying that June had a great deal to say about everything, and said all of it at full volume, a quality that showed no signs of diminishing. Nathan said one evening, watching June narrate the events of her school day to the assembled table including the baby, who was following the performance with wide and interested eyes, that June was going to be either a great politician or the permanent trial of everyone who loved her, and possibly both. "She takes after her father," Evelyn said. "She does not," he said. "She takes after me," Evelyn said. "She is entirely herself," he said, and this was probably correct, and they let the argument rest there with affection. It was in the autumn of 1884, a full 2 years after Evelyn had packed and unpacked her trunk, that she found herself sitting on the porch on an October morning with her coffee and a sleeping James against her shoulder, watching the same stretch of land she had watched the hawk circle over. The cottonwoods were gold again, and the sky was doing its extravagant blue thing, and the air was sharp enough to make breathing feel purposeful. Nathan came out with his own coffee and stood at the porch rail in his usual position. He looked at James, who was sleep-solid against Evelyn's shoulder with his dark hair in disarray and one small fist against his cheek. Then he looked at the land with the expression he had when he was measuring something invisible. "Do you remember this time last year?" she asked. "I remember everything," he said. "I mean the October before that," she said, "when I packed my trunk." He was quiet for a moment. The cottonwoods moved. "I remember," he said. "I told you I was staying for the children," she said. "You did," he said. "I was lying," she said. "Not deliberately, but I was. I was staying for you too." I did not know how to say that. I was afraid of what it meant that I wanted to stay for you, because it felt like too much to want when I was just the housekeeper. He looked at her then, turning from the land to her, and his gray-green eyes had everything in them that they had always had, the steadiness and the warmth and the thing underneath that she had spent months pretending not to see. "I know," he said. "You knew." "I hoped," he said. And yes, knowing and hoping looked very similar in this case. She laughed softly, not to wake the baby. "You are the most infuriatingly patient man I have ever known." "I found something worth being patient for," he said simply. James stirred against her shoulder and made a small sound, not quite waking but reminding them of his presence. The morning light fell across the porch in long golden strips. In the barn, they could hear Eli introducing Cooper to the new day with a running monologue. In the kitchen behind them, Clara was already up and starting the breakfast, because Clara had taken to this with an initiative that was entirely characteristic. And June was still asleep, which was a mercy the morning provided occasionally, and which everyone in the household received as a gift. Evelyn looked at the sky and thought about the hawk, and thought about the notice on a board in San Angelo, and thought about how a life could be made from almost nothing if a person was willing to stay long enough to make it. Nathan came to sit beside her on the porch bench, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he put one arm around her and she leaned into him with the baby between them and the morning opening itself above the Texas plains. "Nathan," she said. "Evelyn," he said. "I am very glad I stayed," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair and said, "So am I." And outside the cottonwoods ran gold against the impossible blue sky, and the hawk, or perhaps a different hawk, circled one long unhurried arc over the southern pasture, free and easy and entirely at home in the boundless Texas air. Clara's portrait of Evelyn was finished in November of 1884. She had spent 3 months on it, filling half the sketchbook with preliminary studies, eyes and then the angle of a jaw, and then the way a hand held a coffee cup, and then the full composition which she approached with the seriousness of someone who understood that the thing being made was meant to last. She brought it to Evelyn on a Tuesday evening, folded carefully inside a piece of brown paper that she had sealed at the edges with the kitchen wax, and she presented it with a formality that was all her own. Evelyn unwrapped it at the kitchen table, with Nathan standing in the doorway and Eli watching from his chair, and June peering over the edge of the table and James asleep in his cradle in the corner. The drawing was extraordinary. Not technically extraordinary in the way of a trained artist, but true in a way that training sometimes worked against. Clara had drawn her in the kitchen, at the table, with a coffee cup and the account ledger open, looking slightly to the left of the viewer with an expression that was intent and warm in equal measure. It looked like her. More than that, it looked like how the person who had made it saw her, which was a different and more intimate thing. Evelyn looked at it for a long time. "Does it look right?" Clara asked, the same question she had asked a year and a half ago about a different drawing, a question that always meant more than its words. "Yes," Evelyn said, and her voice was steady but only barely. "It looks exactly right." Clara nodded, satisfied in the way she was satisfied when something had been done correctly. She sat down at the table and helped herself to a biscuit, business concluded, and the kitchen returned to its usual evening sounds. Nathan came and stood behind Evelyn's chair, looking at the drawing over her shoulder. He said nothing. He set one hand on her shoulder and left it there, and that was enough. The portrait went on the wall in the front room, beside a photograph that existed of Nathan Weston from the early days of the ranch, because Evelyn had put it there herself and Nathan had looked at her when she did it with something in his face that was very full and very grateful. Both women on the same wall, both loved, both remembered, the house big enough for all of it. In the early months of 1885, Evelyn discovered she was carrying a second child, which she told Nathan on a February morning with the same plain directness she had used the first time, and which he received with the same full and unguarded response, steadier this time because the shape of the feeling was familiar, but no less genuine for being so. This time the children knew before she told them, because June had announced it at breakfast one morning 2 weeks earlier with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who simply knew things. And when they said she could not possibly know that, June had looked at them with a benevolent patience that suggested she forgave them for their limited perception. The second child arrived in September, another boy, with Evelyn's coloring and Nathan's mouth, and a set of lungs that announced his arrival to the general neighborhood of Redemption Creek. They called him Robert, after Nathan's older brother who had stayed in Virginia, and with whom Nathan maintained a careful and fond correspondence. Robert Weston joined the household with the disruptive enthusiasm of a new person who had not been consulted about the existing order and saw no reason to accommodate it. James, at nearly 2 years old, regarded his new brother with a mixture of suspicion and interest that resolved itself within a month into something that resembled territorial fondness, which was the best the household had hoped for. Clara, at 11, managed the chaos with the authority of a natural administrator. Eli, at 9, became Robert's most enthusiastic audience when Robert began to make sounds that were not quite words, treating each new vocalization as a significant development worthy of report. June, at 6, treated Robert as both a personal possession and a celebrity, and Nathan said privately to Evelyn that he had a feeling Robert was either going to be the most confident person in any room or the most bewildered, and possibly both, depending on whether he ever worked out that not everyone had a June. Redemption Creek moved through its seasons, the hard winters and the extravagant springs and the punishing summers and the golden autumns, and the Weston Ranch moved through them with the steady rhythm of a place that knew what it was and what it was for. Nathan's reputation as a fair and capable rancher had spread through the surrounding counties, and there was talk of a larger cattle operation possible if he wished to expand, which he considered carefully and discussed with Evelyn and the ranch hands and the cattle themselves, in his way, before deciding on a measured growth that preserved the quality of what they already had. Evelyn continued to manage the household accounts and had expanded, quietly and practically, into managing the purchasing negotiations with the merchants in San Angelo, because she was better at it than Nathan, and he had recognized this early and had the good sense to use it. The feed merchant and the dry goods merchant and the flour merchant in San Angelo had all learned, over the course of 2 years, that Mrs. Weston did not accept the first price offered, had done her arithmetic, and was prepared to source elsewhere if necessary. They had also learned that her word, once given, was reliable to the last cent, which made her someone they actively wanted to do business with. Mabel Sutherland at the post office continued to be the town's primary archivist of Weston family developments, a role she executed with obvious satisfaction and considerable accuracy. The years accumulated in the way that good years did, not slowly or fast but fully, each one complete in itself and connected to the ones before and after. The children grew with the decisiveness of people who had something to grow into. Clara, at 13, had the sketchbook half full with drawings of the ranch and the plains and the people she loved, and the Missouri schoolmarm had said privately to Evelyn that the girl had a mind that would reward whatever education it could get, and Evelyn had filed this away with the careful intention of a woman who was already working on what that meant and what it might cost and how to make it possible. Eli, at 11, had developed, somewhat to everyone's surprise, a genuine aptitude for the ranch work that went beyond enthusiasm into real skill. He had a way with animals that was more than affection. It was a kind of communication, patient and attentive, that the animals seemed to find compelling. Nathan watched him work with the horses one afternoon and came in afterward and told Evelyn that Eli was going to be a very good rancher someday, and Evelyn said she thought so too, and they were both simply glad about it in the uncomplicated way of parents whose children were becoming themselves well. June at 8 had moderated her volume approximately 0%, and had added to her original qualities a reading habit that was voracious and indiscriminate. She read everything she could get her hands on, fiction and almanacs and whatever newspapers arrived at Redemption Creek, and she reported on everything she read at length to anyone who would listen, and many who would rather not. The schoolmarm had promoted her to the advanced reading group, and said June was the most argumentative student she had ever taught, which she said with the tone of someone who found this a pleasure and a challenge in equal measure. James was 2, and was at the stage where everything was interesting, and nothing was too far to climb toward. Robert was 1 and had acquired, in his brief time on Earth, the ability to produce expressions that were so identical to Nathan's that everyone who saw them felt the odd temporal disorientation of seeing something repeat itself. On a May evening in 1886, Evelyn and Nathan sat on the porch after supper in the lengthening spring light, both of them with the particular quiet of people who have had a full day and are satisfied with it. The sounds of the children came through the house and the yard, the thump of Eli and Clara playing something complicated, June's voice providing commentary, James's toddle-related disasters. "Do you ever think about San Angelo?" Nathan asked. "About the notice on the board?" "Sometimes," she said. "Not the way I used to." "How do you think about it now?" "With gratitude," she said. "Without the fear that used to come with it. The fear that I had made myself too dependent on a situation I could not control." She paused. "I spent a long time being afraid of needing things I might lose." "And now?" he asked. "Now I think the risk of needing things was worth it," she said. "Because I did not lose them, and even if I had," she considered this carefully, "even if things had gone differently, I think I would rather have had this for whatever time there was than not had it at all." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I used to think the same about losing Catherine, that I would rather have had what we had than been safe from it." "Yes," she said. "I think a person can hold both things," he said, "missing someone and being full. I think they can live together without one diminishing the other." "I think so too," she said. The evening light was doing the extraordinary thing it did in spring on the Texas plains, going golden and then rose, and then a deep warm amber that made the land look lit from within. The cottonwoods along the creek were full green, their leaves catching the last of the light and returning it changed. Nathan reached over and took her hand, the same gesture he had made 1,000 times in 3.5 years of marriage, easy and unhurried, and she turned her hand over and held his the way she always did, with the same ease, the same unhurried certainty. The children's sounds continued through the yard and the house. James appeared around the corner of the porch with the unsteady determination of a nearly 2-year-old who has a destination in mind, but is negotiating with gravity about the terms. He reached the porch steps, sat down on the bottom one, and looked up at his parents with the serene satisfaction of a small person who has arrived exactly where he intended. "There he is," Nathan said. "There he is," Evelyn agreed. James looked at the cottonwoods in the evening light with the focused attention of someone encountering them for the first time, though he had seen them every day of his life. Something about the light or the moment or the angle was new to him, and he sat very still, taking it in, and Evelyn watched him do this with a fullness in her chest that she had stopped trying to name and had simply decided to inhabit. Clara came out and sat on the porch steps beside James, automatically, the way she did most things involving her smaller siblings, without ceremony and without drawing attention to the care. She pointed at the cottonwoods and said something to him in a low voice, and he looked where she pointed and then back at her with the solemn gravity of a child who has been told something worth knowing. Eli appeared with June behind him, the complicated game apparently concluded, and they arranged themselves in the yard in the haphazard way of children at the end of a day, not quite settling, not quite done, and Robert was brought out in Nathan's arms a moment later, fresh from his evening feeding, drowsy and warm and breathing with the deep, unconcerned breath of someone who had assessed the world and found it sufficiently safe to sleep in. They were all here. All of them on the porch and in the yard of the Weston ranch, in the golden evening of a May that smelled like new grass and creek water, and the wood smoke that never entirely left the air of the house. Evelyn looked at Nathan, and he looked at her, and between them the sleeping Robert breathed steadily, and around them the children made the sounds of children who were loved and knew it, and behind them the house they had made together held the warmth of all its occupied rooms, and before them the Texas plains stretched in every direction to a horizon that was burning rose and gold and violet under the enormous sky. She had come here with a trunk and a name and a determination not to need too much. She had stayed for the children, she had told him, not for him. Stay for whatever reason you like, he had said. She had stayed. And she had been given back everything she had not dared to want, and more than that, things she had not known were possible to want, and more than that still, things she had not had the imagination to predict, which was the best kind of gift, the unimaginable kind, the kind that arrived as consequence of a person being brave enough to stay in one place long enough for the place to become theirs. The hawk, or a hawk, or perhaps all the hawks there had ever been over this particular stretch of red rock and cottonwood and impossible sky, made one long, easy circle over the southern pasture, and then turned south, unhurried, free, and entirely at home in the world it was moving through. Evelyn Barrett Weston watched it go with a full heart and a settled soul, and turned back to her family and stayed.